All right, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to New Energy Conversations with Early Career Energy Researchers. My name is Megan, and I'm the manager of academic initiatives at the Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth College. And I'm very excited to welcome everyone here today for this talk of our spring season of the series. So for folks who are joining us for the first time, I'll give a quick little background on our New Energy initiative. So the goal of our New Energy program is to connect, empower, and raise the profile of early stage researchers in energy and climate. And one way we do this is through this New Energy webinar, which started during the pandemic and has continued since. We've hosted over 50 emerging scholars so far who have been able to share their work more broadly through this webinar. And we also host an annual in-person New Energy Summer Summit that aims to increase the capacity of early stage energy and climate researchers to accelerate transitions to equitable and sustainable energy systems and a healthy climate via interdisciplinary scholarship and collaboration. We had over 100 applications to the summit this year from all over the US and the world, and we're looking forward to welcoming our new cohort for the summit this July. Just one more quick note before we begin. After the talk today, we'll have an opportunity for discussion. So please feel free to enter your questions at any time during the program, and we will get to as many as possible after the presentation. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, I am delighted to kick us off today by introducing our moderator for this session, Dr. Christopher Snedden, who is a professor of geography and environmental studies here at Dartmouth. Professor Snedden's research and teaching interests come together around the question of how to reconcile human activities with the long-term resilience and vulnerability of ecological systems. Most of his work has focused on human uses of water, and in particular on the transformation of river basins due to large-scale development. At Dartmouth, he teaches courses on political ecology, nature-society relations, qualitative research methods, the geopolitics of development, the environmental politics of Southeast Asia, and environmental history. Professor Snedden received a BS in zoology from the University of Wisconsin, an MS in resource policy and planning at the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and Environment, and a PhD in geography from the University of Minnesota, focusing on conflicts over water in Northeast Thailand. So welcome, Professor Snedden. We are so happy to have you here. I'm going to pass it over to you now to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Megan. Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you all for joining us. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Maddy Kroot, who probably recognized some of those courses that I taught since she was in them, what seems like ages ago. So Maddy is a PhD candidate at Clark University's Graduate School of Geography. Excuse me. Her dissertation research looks at community opposition to new high voltage transmission lines in northern New England, focusing on the Northern Pass Project in New Hampshire and the New England Clean Energy Connect project in Western Maine. These transmission lines are intended to increase imports of hydroelectricity from Hydro-Quebec to meet decarbonization targets in Massachusetts. Using spatial justice as a lens, she considers how the dual mandates of decarbonization and energy demonstration lead to, quote, green on green conflict in energy governance when the regional and planetary benefits of grid decarbonization and reduced carbon emissions come into friction with localized impacts to landscape conservation, rural livelihoods, and a sense of place. Maddy is a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow and a Jack Kent Cooke Foundation Graduate Scholar, and holds a Bachelor of Arts degrees in Geography and Linguistics from Dartmouth College. Just to add a quick personal note and maybe help us frame the conversation, this is actually a quote I took from my own letter for Maddy's application to graduate school, and I think it still remains true to this day. It's a really exciting time to be engaged in the scholarly arenas of energy landscapes and conflicts over renewable energy systems. I have long wondered about the odd gaps in geography and related disciplines in general when it comes to energy, which touches on so many of the discipline's central concerns, including the spatiality of infrastructure, struggles over environmental transformation, and discourses of greening society. So I think Maddy's research will help fill these gaps in really excellent ways and contribute to emerging scholarship in geographies of energies extraordinarily well. So Maddy, over to you, and thanks for joining us.
All right, thanks for that, Chris. Good to know what you told Clark to let me in the first place. So for my first trick, I will make screen share work. All right, and then there are my slides. Chris, could you confirm you're seeing my slides and not my presenter notes?
I see your slides.
Beautiful. Alrighty. Hi all, thank you for having me. As Chris said, my name is Maddy. I'm a Dartmouth Class of 2019, now a PhD candidate in geography at Clark University down in Worcester, Mass. I thought Chris would say this, but I'll throw it out there anyway. My doctoral research actually began in an earlier life as my undergraduate thesis in the geography department here at Dartmouth. But before that, it actually began as a random assignment in my first year seminar class with Professor Jonathan Winter in probably January 2016. So I owe a lot of this work to Dartmouth, particularly to the geography department, and this was when the Irving Institute was but a sparkle in the eyes of the college. So I will just say for any undergrads in the audience, be careful what you write about in your random first year courses because it might go on to consume the next 10 years of your life. Anyway, that disclaimer being made, today I'll be sharing some work from my doctoral fieldwork entitled How to Kill a Power Line, Utility on Utility Violence and Electricity Capital and Energy Infrastructure Disputes. So just to situate myself for a moment, given our multidisciplinary audience, my work sits at the confluence, as Chris sort of conveniently framed me here, of political ecology, energy geographies, and science and technology studies, particularly work on technopolitics and critical infrastructure studies. I am broadly interested in how the massive build-out of new energy infrastructure necessary for plans for energy transition will transform landscapes, and in doing so, potentially run into conflict with other place-based politics around land use planning, place attachments, and competing environmentalisms centered on landscape conservation rather than carbon emissions. And I position my current work at the overlap of these three fields, with a focus on what I call spatial justice and energy transitions, drawing on work by Edward Soja, Stephen Buzarofsky, David Harvey, Kamala Yannetti, and others. I understand spatial justice as emphasizing the inherent spatiality of political struggles over energy transitions, and I divide this into three parts. So first, I pay attention to the politics of just transitions, so how the infrastructural demands of energy transitions are linked with potentially conflicting visions for broader social, political, and ecological transformations. Second, I look at scalar politics, how competing scalar framings of the climate crisis and decarbonization projects emphasize certain impacts to communities and ecologies while eliding others. And third, I consider participatory politics, how the urgency of decarbonization potentially comes into conflicts with the democratization of energy governance, as planning and permitting processes legitimize and enfranchise certain publics and not others. So while my talk today touches on all three of these aspects, I will largely be focusing on this last issue of participatory politics. And to briefly situate this talk within my broader study, I explore local opposition to two proposed high voltage transmission lines through northern New England, the Northern Pass project in New Hampshire and the New England Clean Energy Connect project in Maine, sometimes called the CMP corridor after its parent utility. Both projects intend to carry hydroelectricity from Quebec to Massachusetts, and both at one point were the recipients of a lucrative contract to meet Massachusetts state climate targets by providing upwards of 1,200 megawatts of power over a 20-year contract, enough for approximately 1.2 million households. Northern Pass was ultimately killed after 8 years of intense local opposition led to the rejection of its New Hampshire state permit in 2018. The CMP corridor has been messier. At one point, its main state permits were revoked by a statewide ballot initiative, only to be reinstated by the courts. And the project now appears to be moving forward, albeit several years and millions of dollars behind schedule. The larger dissertation aims to understand high voltage transmission lines as conduits of not just electricity, but power, enabling the displacement of the landscape transformations of energy transition away from the sites of consumption, here largely the greater Boston area where I now live, to rural areas that act as extension cords. For this talk, I will mostly restrain myself from reliving my undergraduate career by talking at length about large-scale dams. Sorry, Chris, I'll leave that to you. except to say that long-distance transmission also contributes to what some argue is the greenwashing of historic, ongoing, and expanding hydroelectric generation on Indigenous territories in Quebec. So in sum, the project uses transmission to think about the spatiality of energy transitions, where and who bears what uneven impacts, and how that is justified in plans for just energy transitions. Methodologically, my research draws on mixed qualitative methods. I rely heavily on semi-structured interviews with grid planners, energy officials, grid activists, environmental NGOs, and especially private landowners opposed to each of my case studies. With interviews primarily conducted in person at people's kitchen tables to situate the perspectives in place. In some ways, I am doing what my interview participants fault developers for not doing, meeting stakeholders where they're at and seeing the places where transmission lines are proposed to go in person, rather than from a map from some distant boardroom. And this interview corpus is complemented by document and material analysis of various reports, legislation, permitting documents, and protest materials, as well as over 60 hours at this point of participant observation of grid activist meetings, grid operator meetings, some satirical street theater outside of a grid operator meeting, so in the second photo from the left, state transmission planning working groups, and the landscapes up and down the proposed routes that stand to be impacted by transmission development. In short, I spend a lot of time driving around rural New England doing ethnography from my Prius, and I might be the only person who actually drives around looking for power lines, which among other things has made me impossible company on road trips. That being said, the goal of this project is to understand local opposition to transmission lines as one form of low carbon energy infrastructure, which has really become central to plans for energy transition here in New England. So how does a transmission line become controversial? Why, and for which actors? And this question emerged initially as a sectoral gap. There's not much work done on the politics of transmission siting, but it also became clear that these case studies pointed to larger socio-political processes that needed untangling. 2 years ago, for example, I was working on a different project around land use politics in Massachusetts, where one of our central topics was the conflicts within Mass between ground-mounted solar development and other land uses, like local agriculture or forest conservation. This is after not quite right state incentives in Massachusetts led to solar development becoming the leading driver of deforestation and farmland conversion in the state, as well as a key flashpoint between local communities, town zoning boards, land trusts, and state energy policy. But when I explained my dissertation topic to some of the NGOs we were working with in Massachusetts, who were opposing what they saw as reckless solar development, they were quick to tell me that my topic was important because all those NGOs up in New Hampshire and Maine had been duped by the fossil fuel industry into fighting a clean transmission project. So I wanted to think about accounting for this dissonance. How can we explain these mixed messages and stances? So broadly speaking, actors on the ground, policymakers, and academics tend to frame community opposition to low carbon energy infrastructure within 3 main buckets. First, there is quote unquote genuine grassroots opposition. In my case studies, the opposition is an eclectic mix of property owners, municipal governments, and environmental NGOs, ranging from the Sierra Club to local land trusts. This grassroots framing is often associated with notions of environmental and energy justice, though in this case, the impacted groups are overwhelmingly white, though socioeconomically diverse, targeted for locally unwanted infrastructure projects primarily based on their rurality. Under this framing, hosting energy infrastructure is understood as an uneven burden imposed on communities by outside actors, in this case, for-profit transmission developers. Second, there is climate NIMBYism, or the Not in My Backyard movement. In this framing, groups oppose socially necessary and largely benign energy infrastructure projects out of ignorance, hypocrisy, or self-interest. In effect, we can understand climate NIMBYism as a conflict of scales. Attachment and commitment to the stewardship of the local backyard versus the regional and planetary need to decarbonize. Transmission is a particularly tricky and thus productive space to think about scale, given that transmission is a linear infrastructure, deeply local in its siting, but that moves electricity nearly instantaneously across vast distances to serve a regional grid and reduce planetary emissions in this case. Beyond this, we have the added interstate tension of siting projects in rural New Hampshire and Maine to meet the state climate targets of urban and suburban Massachusetts. While the imported hydropower would go to all of the New England grid, these were projects initiated, planned, and financed largely in coordination with Massachusetts policy goals. Third, community opposition may be explained by astroturfing, when fossil fuel interests create fake opposition groups or dupe communities into opposing clean energy projects in order to protect the profitability of fossil assets. Increasingly, this is being discussed by folks like Timmons Roberts at Brown through the lens of climate delayism and climate obstructionism, a concerted effort by fossil fuel incumbents not necessarily to deny climate science, but to delay the construction of new energy infrastructure via campaigns of misinformation, or at least skepticism and doubt about the prospective impacts of renewable technologies. Beyond the ways these different discourses frame the impacts of new energy infrastructure, a given community's responsibility to host it, and the way these intersect with the broader political economy of energy, we can look at how each of these framings, broadly speaking, understands its primary actors. So both the grassroots framing and climate NIMBYism tend to understand energy infrastructure conflicts as primarily taking place between two actors, communities and the developer behind the controversial project itself, albeit against the background of broader societal forces. Astroturfing and the literature on climate delayism, meanwhile, brings in outside energy capital as an actor, but is primarily focused on how outside capital shapes public stances on a proposed project. The proposed project itself tends to fade into the background a bit, while communities are often taken as a sort of blank slate, influenced primarily by the machinations of outside actors. What I focus on in this talk, however, is a slightly different explanation for these dynamics, though I would position it within the broader conversation around climate delayism. So last summer, I was interviewing a man who asked to be referred to only by his participant number, who managed to disturb my carefully developed understanding of the Northern Pass project by telling me something new, that Northern Pass had been killed not simply by the strength of local opposition, but by another utility, and that the same actor had also been conspiring to kill the CMP corridor. While I had heard those rumors about the CMP corridor, this was news to me in New Hampshire, after 7 years of following Northern Pass and many in-depth conversations with members of the opposition up and down the line. Participant 8, and you'll have to trust me when I say he's very knowledgeable in the regional grid space, went on to explain to me what he called utility on utility violence, actions taken by incumbent electricity capital, so existing players in the regional grid, to slow or block new entrants via the strategic manipulation of different electricity governance procedures, most notably by weaponizing the mandate for public participation and citing and permitting new infrastructure. Under this dynamic, the opposition is not manufactured as per astroturfing, but it arises through tensions between would-be host communities and the project developer, and is then amplified by outside actors, in this case, competing firms. So my argument here is thus that we need to recognize the role of competing factions of electricity capital in these controversies, alongside the roles of local opposition and the project developer itself. This is significant both in terms of understanding energy politics, but also because utility on utility violence demands different policy solutions than those suggested in response to climate NIMBYism or astroturfed climate delayism, for example. If NIMBYism suggests the necessary solution involves curtailing public participation, what is often discussed as permitting reform, utility on utility violence suggests it is the actions of electricity capital that need greater attention and regulation. In turn, attention solely to astroturfing can have the effect of letting project developers off the hook for poor community engagement and siting mitigation by assuming that the only reason to oppose new low carbon energy infrastructure is because you've been duped by the fossil fuel industry. So how does competition work in the grid? First, a necessarily oversimplified crash course on regional electricity markets. New England, like many but not all areas of the US, operates under a regional transmission operator, or RTO. RTOs are independent system operators who manage wholesale electricity markets, operate regional grids, and plan transmission development for issues like reliability. Generation, transmission, and distribution infrastructure continue to be privately owned by different firms, but the operation of the transmission system has been ceded to RTOs, so that company A's generation might travel on company B's transmission lines so that company C can distribute the electricity to your house. The goal was to make the electricity sector more efficient and competitive by placing grid operation under an independent technocratic organization and treating transmission infrastructure as a sort of de facto socialized system with broader access mediated by the RTO and based on market principles. So at the root of utility on utility violence is the way the wholesale market operates. What gives utility on utility violence its particular oomph in the electricity sector is the fact that generators can only produce and sell their electricity through the RTO as a gatekeeper, and the primary means to do so is based on price point, which means that there's effectively a cap on the rates a generator can charge for its electricity without jeopardizing its ability to run. So an RTO forecasts demand, say for the following day. Generators then bid into the market to provide X amount of that total demand, and the RTO accepts the cheapest bids until it reaches its forecasted demand, which is marked here on the D part of the graph. That nth bid clears the market and sets the price at which all generators in the bid stack are paid. Therefore, some generators operate as what's called a price taker. They bid in at $0, knowing the clearing price will be higher. These price takers stand to lose a lot of profit if new large-scale projects enter the regional grid, say cheap Quebec hydropower subsidized in part through a Massachusetts procurement contract, because it will drop the clearing price. The only way to provide electricity is via the RTO's markets, so electricity capital must keep their prices below the clearing price in order to consistently operate their generation and sell their commodity. So for electricity capital with fixed costs, the best way to maintain consistent profit is therefore to maintain a consistent clearing price. So in my research, I've identified a number of different tactics for utility on utility violence, some of which overlap with broader tactics for climate delay, including influencing market rules through the RTO, lobbying for or against particular energy legislation, and through simply delaying infrastructure upgrades to privately owned facilities that are necessary to allow the interconnection of new projects. For this talk, I'll focus on the last two bolded points here, which relate to the weaponization of public participation. So what has really struck me from this research is that this utility on utility violence is very much an open secret. I thought I would have to tiptoe around the issue, but interview participants often bring it up freely as a known dynamic. So here, participant 25, a representative of Hydro-Quebec, explained that there is almost a playbook deploying the same strategies in both of my case studies. She points to an article in The Atlantic where a journalist describes attending a marketing conference where a guest speaker from the American Petroleum Institute describes what she calls the social licensing model. This journalist, or the guest speaker rather, not my interview participant. So under this social licensing model, incumbent capital only needs to find one thing in common with citizen or environmental groups, like opposition to a transmission line, in order to amplify those groups as their speakers, their voice. So in a grid framed as technocratic and apolitical, electricity capital stays under the radar by letting the public be the face of opposition to new projects, so that publics become irrational actors and incumbents remain public utilities just trying to keep the lights on while meeting climate targets. So what does weaponizing public participation look like? In my case studies, perceptions of poor route design, insufficient community engagement, inadequate compensation packages, intra-regional tensions, and pre-existing lack of trust in utilities lead to genuine opposition, but often by small rural communities with few resources or by environmental NGOs with little experience in energy siting. To be clear, incumbents also appear to be directly creating a small number of opposition groups. This is difficult to prove definitively, but these are generally groups that spend a lot of money on advertising, but I can't find any members. But the vast majority of opposition tends to arise organically in my case studies. And in many cases, prominent opponents are longstanding environmental groups in their states who are forbidden by their bylaws and reputational politics from accepting fossil fuel money, not small groups that popped up overnight with shiny websites and no discernible history. So the murkiness of utility on utility violence is exemplified by the group Say No to NECEC, which is a stalwart of opposition in the northernmost section of the CMP corridor, but has also been widely vilified as astroturfed by the larger environmental and energy community in New England. This is driven by the fact that Say No to NECEC received funding that could ultimately be traced to a consortium of fossil fuel and nuclear interests, grants via nonprofits associated with shell companies of fossil firms, that kind of thing. But various members of this group explained to me how the group, at its core, a bunch of degenerate raft guides dependent on a seasonal tourism economy threatened by the CMP corridor, went deeply into debt in order to pay for the lawyers necessary to navigate the many layers of permitting at the federal and state levels. So they eventually applied for this grant, not initially knowing its ultimate funding source, in order to avoid a lien taken out on their properties. So as participant 32 explains, they were not duped by incumbent interests, instead seeing this collaboration as a sort of necessary evil in order to participate fully in a complex, multi-scalar permitting conflict. So there are two main political effects I want to highlight here. The first is that the sort of specter of utility on utility violence creates a culture of suspicion towards certain parts of the public, where certain communities' reasons to oppose a project become suspect, and therefore they can be more readily dismissed out of hand. So what arises is a sort of witch hunt, where any group that opposes the project might be assumed to be morally and financially compromised, which also points to particular expectations around some sort of environmentalist purity and an obligation to altruistically host infrastructure projects for the greater good of society, in this case, other state climate policies. This causes particular problems for environmental groups by fracturing coalitions, as certain groups are unable or unwilling to partner out of moral legal stances around concerns over funding sources, part of what the lower left New York Times article describes as the clean energy future roiling both friends and foes. More generally, even groups who would not or don't need to accept funding from mystery sources can't do anything to stop astroturf groups from running advertisements, that happen to align with their position on a controversial siting issue, which in turn can lead to them being painted with the same brush. So part of the complexity of these siting concerns, particularly for a linear infrastructure like transmission that has both point-specific and landscape-level impacts, is that the for and against camps both contain many different tents. So more fundamentally, we end up with a regional politics of the grid where long-standing environmental groups are accused of being anti-green on this one issue, and therefore their epistemic credibility in other cases is undermined. Second, and I apologize for the long block quote here, is that by mobilizing citizen and environmental groups as the face of opposition to low carbon energy infrastructure, utility on utility violence has the effect of promoting particular policy solutions over others. So the narratives of climate NIMBYism and astroturfing are persistent and pervasive, even amongst climate activists and academics who spend a lot of time critiquing energy capital and centering environmental energy and climate justice issues in their work. And this is not without good reason. Sometimes opposition can ultimately be accounted for by existing explanations for NIMBYism and climate obstructionism. My point is that we can't assume that a priori, and there are risks and consequences for doing so. So, for example, one growing solution to project delays and cancellations is permitting reform. So in regards to interstate transmission lines, many of the proposals have to do with changing the permitting process from a state-by-state system to instead doing permitting at the federal level, like we do for interstate oil and gas pipelines. The success of public opposition in slowing or canceling projects, like we've seen with Northern Pass in the CMP corridor, has led some advocates to point to a need to streamline permitting under regionally or nationally scaled jurisdictions, rather than relying on existing permitting processes scaled to the state that often grant a lot of authority to local governments, particularly New England with its traditions of home rule. As participant 13, a staff member at Public Citizen explains, the push towards permitting reform aims to make it easier to build and site energy infrastructure and accommodate developers. And there are good reasons to identify this as a problem, and our energy governance certainly needs reforms to accommodate a decarbonizing grid, both in RTO governance and in for siting particular projects. Participant 13's concern, however, is that at the end of the day, he's concerned that communities will be sacrificed for expediency on the part of corporate developers, even if the corporate developers are trying to decarbonize the grid. Instead, he asks, what can project developers do to accommodate host communities? As he describes, doing all the right things won't be guaranteed to address utility on utility violence, but utility on utility violence thrives under policy of business as usual. So Briefly, attention to utility on utility violence points to different policy solutions than suggested by a narrow focus on host communities versus project developers, or on local communities as blank slates duped by fossil fuel interests. So first, there's a need for governance reform within RTOs to dilute the power of incumbents to shape market rules. This is a whole nother dissertation, but the broader governance rules of many RTOs, like New England's, favor incumbent firms over new entrants, and incumbents are obviously invested in their existing fossil fuel fleets. Changing the market rules could get at some of the root drivers and enablers of utility on utility violence. And many such changes are already possible under Federal Energy Regulatory Commission rules, though it would take some political will on behalf of the RTOs and state governments, which don't always have formal voting power in RTO governance. 2, states can take action to discipline capital that engages in utility on utility violence, especially against state contracted projects, for instance, by penalizing them in future state solicitations. There would be some legal logistics to work out here that I'll defer to the lawyers, but the paper trail exists for this open secret, and states are presumably invested in their contracted projects being built on time so they can meet their legislated climate targets. 3, and more broadly, the Supreme Court case decision in Citizens United shields corporate political donations and has encouraged the proliferation of dark money in politics. Overturning this would help reduce the murkiness of incumbent actions by requiring greater transparency from shadowy nonprofits and campaign donations. 4, engaging in permitting disputes is expensive and time-consuming. Greater financial, legal, and technical resources to support citizen groups, some from towns in my case studies as small as 40 people, would help reduce the sort of devil's bargain made by groups like Say No to NECEC. Existing offices like the Council for the Public or state consumer advocates are often understaffed, and in cases where the controversial project has received a state contract, there may be the perception of a conflict of interest. Environmental NGOs like the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests and the Natural Resource Council of Maine have taken on much of the job of providing basic training on how to give testimony and cross-examine expert witnesses. But given the large-scale build-out of new energy infrastructure planned, we need a more sustainable model that not only allows public participation in energy planning, but actually enables it. And lastly, and perhaps more importantly, weaponizing public participation is most effective when there is pre-existing local opposition to projects. That opposition could be mitigated through better project design, community engagement, and compensation. We might call this proposal reform, fostering or requiring developer norms that lead to more locally acceptable projects, compared to permitting reform, which sees project delays and cancellations as caused by uncooperative publics, rather than acknowledging the actions of electricity capital, incumbent and new entrants alike. So in my study area, I'm already seeing new transmission projects proposed that appear to take notes from the struggles of Northern Pass and the CMP corridor, though none have yet been contracted and built. The increasing role of the state in energy development at the subnational level through power purchasing agreements, but also at the federal level through new infrastructure grant programs, means that the state is increasingly in a position to incentivize due norms for for-profit developers seeking state funding for projects, the same way Massachusetts required protections for environmental justice communities in its existing contracts, for example. So perhaps my spiciest take of the dissertation so far is that community opposition to projects is not inevitable, and by proposing more acceptable projects, we can cut off the fuel that makes utility on utility violence so effective in the first place. So my ultimate concern then is that utility on utility violence, despite very much being an open secret in my study area, will continue to feed a narrative that pits rural communities as standing in the way of clean, green progress, rather than recognizing the role that electricity capital plays in feeding those controversies, both in proposing poorly designed projects in the first place and in using the resulting opposition as a cover to attack the competition. And with that, I'll close us for questions.
All right. Thank you, Maddy. That was wonderful and enlightening. And I think we are taking questions through the question and answer function that folks should have. And while we're maybe waiting for anybody who might be typing, I have a question that maybe could start us off. It's sort of a two-parter, so feel free to just answer as much or as little as you want. It struck me that there is a role for the government or the state in all of this, right? And I just wonder, either at the state level, in the states that you know well in New England, or maybe even at the federal level, and you allude to this, is there an office or a committee or something, some body that would actually be looking out for this kind of utility on utility violence? And then secondly, the flip side of that question, are the companies themselves sort of thinking strategically? Is this something that just kind of like, oh, we'll have Bill in in PR do this? On both sides of that, the ones that are advocating for more renewables versus the ones that maybe are saying that are the incumbents and want to like sort of prevent it. So in other words, are there like sort of institutions within those different organizations that might be looking at these sorts of issues?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll start with the second one. I don't know how the inner workings of the companies that are sort of, we'll say, committing this utility on utility violence work, other than I know that there are broad patterns across a lot of these large companies across states, so not just in New England. So I alluded to some projects that I think are trying to learn from these mistakes. So there was one project, for instance, that National Grid proposed that I've been asking people, like, what's your stance on this in Northern Pass, in New Hampshire, rather, after Northern Pass, because it's broadly similar. And what they did is, before even proposing the project, they met with every community along the route, sort of preemptively addressing concerns and tailoring compensation packages. And then the ultimate route they proposed was either completely buried down state roads in Vermont, or in the New Hampshire section, it used a new technology called reconductoring to basically carry more electricity on the existing power line. And this made the project more expensive, but in part for recognition of those efforts, it had received a big grant from the federal government's new transmission facilitation program. They never quite announced how much that grant was worth, but I suspect it would have gone good ways to sort of making it cost competitive with Northern Pass and the CMP corridors price tags, while also meaning that, from what I could tell on the ground, it would have had really little community opposition in Vermont and New Hampshire. Unfortunately, that project never found a buyer because of the way, I guess, congestion, say, in these contracts in New England right now, and so they actually just shelved that project, which is points to other problems with how this planning is happening. So I think part of the issue is I don't think developers necessarily anticipated that these transmission lines would be controversial, so they didn't think to take sort of preemptive actions, but I think people are seeing the writing on the wall now. As for state level institutions working on this, I think there's a lot of reorganizing going on how states approach regional and federal energy policies. So in Massachusetts, for instance, they just finished convening a working group on clean energy transmission. There's a new Office of Federal and Regional Energy Affairs, and Massachusetts in particular is taking a really active role in the regional grid space, sort of working with and also separately from our existing RTO. So how much they're looking for this utility on utility violence, I don't know, but it certainly points to sort of greater state participation and awareness, and not just sort of assuming the market will take care of it.
Right. Great. That's wonderful. So there are some questions coming in, and I don't know if you want to just look at them or if I should sort of repeat them and then you can think.
I guess I can just pick them, I guess.
Okay.
So the first question is from Honor, who asks, how would overturning Citizens United change this landscape? I think the sort of primary issue there is that, in my understanding, being not a constitutional lawyer, but the Citizens United decision provided cover. It said that basically corporate donations were a form of protected free speech, and therefore that a lot of really long-standing corporate donation laws were unconstitutional. And so this means it's a lot easier for a company to create a nonprofit, for instance, not disclose its ultimate sources of funding, and then move money around for political issues. My understanding is that if we sort of overturn Citizens United, or if Congress passed new laws around this, that it would require sort of greater transparency in how the money moves around. Robert asked to describe the term astroturfing in more detail. Is this my term or is it an accepted term? I did not come up with this term. It's sort of a riff on the idea of grassroots opposition. So the idea being like astroturf is fake grass, therefore astroturfed opposition is fake opposition. This is a long-standing term. I think it's sort of being moved into this emerging conversation on climate delayism and climate obstructionism. So the idea being that the tactic is no longer to deny climate science, but to introduce doubt, basically, that will just delay the rolling out of energy policies. Cool. Sarah gave me a long question.
It's a good one.
Yeah, it usually is. So Sarah says, as with so many other climate action energy transition issues, the situation in New England regarding the regulatory environment for transmission lines is definitely one of the critical implementation gaps we need to address. Will at Kempton, in studying offshore wind in Delaware 15 to 20 years ago, overcame the problem of incumbent bias, in part through strong focus on local engagement. Your solutions also suggest such an approach, but who will do this? How do we find the people funds to ensure that this kind of intervention happens and therefore avoids the implementation gap? So yeah, I think, Sarah, you're sort of thinking along the same lines as Chris. I guess my strategy towards this is both, I should take several steps back. We don't build transmission lines of this size very often. In New England, the last sort of comparable transmission line was built in the 80s in a really different regulatory environment. So part of it, I think, is that this is sort of pushing the boundaries of existing infrastructure planning. So part of this, I think, is that developers didn't think that there would be this implementation gap. And the Northern Pass case in particular, for instance, it's sort of, or the origins of the project came out of the New Hampshire State Climate Action Plan, where one of their proposed solutions was to import more hydropower from Quebec. So the sense I get from talking to some people is that the developer thought they already had the go-ahead, and that, you know, everyone would just love the plan because it was in the Climate Action Plan, right? Which was put together by 20 agency heads, right? It wasn't something voted on. So I think part of it is that there's this unfortunate lag in developers proposing plans, getting contracts for it, and then coming to this realization that this preemptive work is really important if you actually want to build the project. So I was talking about this other transmission line. I think they're sort of farther along in this lag, and they're reading the writing on the wall. In terms of who will do this, I think if we're going to continue to have a big emphasis on state procurements, this is something that could be built into those as requirements for contract. So for instance, to sort of put too tight a bow on it, I think a lot of these conflicts over transmission lines could be resolved if a greater portion of them were buried, if not all of them. That's something that could be required in a contract solicitation, but it would require sort of a cost benefit analysis. And basically this game of chicken on how much can you push those norms for developers so that the project will actually be built versus concerns over cost. And then your, yeah, Cape Wind also looms large here. Different set of actors there. But again, I think it points to this sort of specificity in looking at like, okay, why exactly are communities opposing this project, and how reasonable or viable are their concerns to address through alternatives? Roy says, there always seems to be a disconnect between those injured and those benefiting when it comes to dollars. Shouldn't the recipient, like Massachusetts, be required to compensate those injured with long-term financial support, and this backed by federal law? That's a great question. I don't know how federal law implements here, sort of comes into play here. I will say a lot of the discussion on compensation here is the companies are like, well, host community, you'll get property taxes on building this new infrastructure in your town. That's a declining rate of return on property taxes. And depending on the numbers, right, that's not equivalent to concerns about losses in tourism, for instance. Whether Massachusetts would be required to compensate, I don't think is the case. I think formally this is a contract between Hydro-Quebec as the energy supplier, the particular transmission developer, and then Massachusetts as sort of the importer. So part of it is this sort of jurisdictional hot potato. Oh, hi, Thorn. The structure of the Massachusetts request for proposal process had over 40 bids. The competing utilities could hurt their chances of winning if their project is public before the bids are due. This limits the time a competing utility can reach out to the community. Any thoughts about changing the structure for these requests for proposals? That's a great question. And I do think one of the barriers here is just the structure of how these sort of solicitations are done. And again, I think this is sort of a space that's evolving very quickly. So it's sort of playing catch up, unfortunately, on a process where it takes a long time to build a transmission line, and then it takes a long time to evaluate these bids. So I think part of this is developer norms. So, you know, when a proposal started being planned versus when it sort of gets locked in by getting a contract with Massachusetts, I think is really sort of relevant here. So part of the, let's say, tragic irony here maybe with this case study is that the CMP corridor received its contract with Massachusetts fairly early in its planning process, especially relative to Northern Pass. And so by the time it had that contract, it was locked in to a particular budget and in large ways a particular route. So it meant there was less time for the CMP corridor to reverse course once it started running into opposition, which is why I think a lot of this could most effectively be implemented through sort of this upfront adjustments, both in the contract solicitations and in developer norms for how folks think about transmission line planning. And one of the sort of interesting ironies here, perhaps, is that when I'm talking to some environmental NGOs about this, they sort of speak sort of fondly about how gas pipelines approach them and communities about mitigating siting concerns, because the gas pipelines assume that they might be controversial. And I think that's sort of something to chew on here. It's about who, you know, how are we anticipating conflicts before they arise and before we're locked into particular answers or particular proposals, excuse me. I see a question from April. Part of Northern Pass's failure was also a general frustration that low carbon energy infrastructure would run through the viewshed of Northern New England communities, with the value being accrued to residents in Massachusetts. How do you approach this issue opportunity of regionalism when not all community members have the same viewpoints regarding value? Also an excellent question. And I don't mean to be glib by proposing burial as a sort of end all save all sort of mitigation measure. But for me, a lot of this points to the fact that there's a lot of room for greater regional governance issue on this. So our RTO could be planning more policy permission, public policy transmission, excuse me, on its own. And so that would be the sort of entity with this regional purview. It hasn't been doing that, though I think it's making moves to be more active in that space, which leads to this position where Massachusetts is effectively effectively making plans for Northern New England through its contract solicitations. I don't necessarily think doing this through the RTO would really capture that issue of regionalism you're talking about, but it would at least mean that someone at some point was sort of looking at the whole grid and asking, okay, what is objectively the best way to bring hydropower down from Quebec? That might be routing it down Interstate 93 or Interstate 91, for instance. But neither of those options was ever sort of submitted to this bid process with Massachusetts, as Thorn mentioned in his question earlier. So I think it's, you know, how do we sort of think about this collaboratively? We have an anonymous attendee said, you mentioned how the financement of groups such as Say No to NECC by fossil fuel interests is part of the problem. Have you looked at the financement of established and reputable environmental NGOs by the same competitive interests in order to delay or block climate projects? And if so, what are some of the solutions on that front? I haven't dug into exactly where the money comes from some of these sort of more established NGOs. I do know that many of them have bylaws that strictly limit where they can and cannot receive financing. And I know they have different disclosure sort of rules about that. So it sort of goes to some of the broader issues around transparency and corporate donations. Some of that is not publicly available, though it's also, if you think about this question of reputational politics, like if as environmental NGOs, they have certain reputations to protect, and so they're often, I think, very careful about where they take money. But it is hard to sort of track all that money going around. But yeah, it's a good point. And then Sarah Kelly is asking, I was wondering if you are observing that the landscape of transmission line planning and funding has been affected by the Inflation Reduction Act, and if so, how? Yes, definitely. So the National Academy of Sciences came out with a report last year that basically said that the greatest threat to our decarbonization goals is failing to build out the grid to accommodate new renewable energy. And I think the Biden administration has been putting a lot of energy towards, the puns are unavoidable, has been putting a lot of attention and resources towards building out the grid as part of their infrastructure programs. So for example, that transmission facilitation project that I mentioned earlier was funded in part, I think, through the same set of IRA funding mechanisms, though don't quote me on that. So I think there's just a lot of attention going towards that, which means there's probably going to be more of this, which is why I would like us to all sort of get ahead of this messiness. And we're 5 minutes out, so I guess I will stop talking, but thank you all for the excellent questions.
Yeah, those were terrific. And I've been instructed to ask, do you have any last thoughts or final thought?
My brain is kind of fried. I'll say that for me, I think there is a lot of room to, we've been sort of, we being New England here, a certain level of sort of one-off solutions to building out the grid. But we know it's a big problem. It will take a lot of money. It'll take a lot of planning. I think ultimately, the most expensive option here is failure to build projects. So I would rather see us incentivize norms for projects that might be slightly more expensive. For instance, because they use more burial, they spend more time with upfront communications with communities, but that ultimately get built. Because Northern Pass was highly competitive in Massachusetts bid process, but they spent a lot of money only for the project to fail. And so that's a heavy cost in terms of carbon emissions, burnt public goodwill, as well as just time. So I think there's a lot of space to sort of get ahead of this from a planning perspective, but also, and that involves sort of a cultural perspective instead on sort of getting more critical about how we think about opposition.
Wonderful. Well, on behalf of all the participants and the listeners, I would just like to say thank you to Maddy. Good luck with the rest of your graduate career, which I know I'm sure will be stellar. And I'm going to invite Megan back on to say a few words about the next event.
Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you so much, Maddy, for a really excellent talk on a really fascinating topic. It's really great to see you and have you here virtually back at Dartmouth. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone in attendance for all the great questions. Again, so thank you for joining us, and we'll be updating you on our next new energy webinar talks as they are scheduled. But we do have another upcoming talk, which is happening on Tuesday, April 9th from 5:10 to 6 p.m. It'll be here on the Dartmouth campus and also streamed live online. You can use the QR code that is up here on the screen. The title of the talk is Financing a Clean Energy Transition in Africa and the Global South by Andre I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name properly, Reuter. He's the former CEO of Africa's largest electricity company, and he'll be discussing some challenges and opportunities for building renewables and other projects in countries with high capital costs and how we can engineer a better system. So please join us for that talk again. And I want to thank Maddy again for being here and sharing her really important and interesting work with us. And thank you to Chris for joining us and moderating the discussion. And we hope to see you again. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.